Hi, welcome everyone. Panelists, can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Excellent. So
Yes.
thank you. We have our attendees with us tonight, so I wanted to say welcome. Tonight we are continuing our panel series, The Future of Public Space. And so who are we? My name is Katie Denny Horowitz, Executive Director of the North Brooklyn Parks Alliance. And we are the Parks Conservancy for Williamsburg and Greenpoint. This is close to the culmination of a year-long panel conversation, a series we started last year, early on in the pandemic, to bring our programs virtually and have honest conversations about issues facing our parks. In the past, over the last year, we've talked about specific projects, whether under the Cambridge Park or really ambitious projects like BQ Green. We've talked about air quality and open streets. We've talked about policy priorities that we put forth to our future elected officials. And what we wanted to do tonight was really sort of take a step back and look more broadly about some of the things that you may not think about when you think about parks, but is very much on the top of conversation for parks and environmental groups. We wanted to talk about sustainability. We wanted to talk about what's happening with our climate overall, and whose world, your world, because this is, after all, something that we are all working together to really heal and repair. And so we've delved into some of the issues we're going to talk about tonight in our other digital program, our Ask a Gardener series over on Instagram Live. Things like native habitats, urban agriculture, and the importance of bees. And so to dig a little deeper in some of these uses and more increasingly critical functions of our parks and open space, we went to none other than Konstancja, who's a dear friend of ours. So Konstancja Maleszyńska is originally from Poland, although here in Greenpoint, we've been lucky enough to have her for, I'm going to guess 20 years, but she could tell you. And in that time, she has really risen as a leader and an expert in concepts of sustainability, whether she's working here at the North Brooklyn Parks Alliance, or advocating for what I dare say might be her favorite park, McGolrick Park, and got her master's over at Bard in sustainability. We're lucky to have her curate tonight's conversation. She will be introducing the panelists for the who will be having this dialogue. Before we do that, Konstancja, I'm going to share a poem that you asked us to share with the audience, that kind of sets a tone for tonight's conversation, and really brings it outside of the Brooklyn community or even the New York City community, and really looks at this as a global issue, and really thinking about the humanity of it all. So with that, I'm going to share a poem titled For the Hardest Day by Clint Smith.
Some evenings, after days when the world feels like it has poured all of its despair onto me, when I am awash with burdens that rest atop my body like a burlap of jostling shadows, I find a place to watch the sunset. I dig my feet into a soil that has rebirthed itself a million times over. I listen to the sound of leaves as they decide whether or not it is time to descend from their branches. It is hard to describe the comfort one feels in sitting with something you trust will always be there, something you can count on to remain familiar when all else seems awry. How remarkable it is to know that so many have watched the same sunset before you. How the wind can carry pollen and drop it somewhere it has never been. How the leaves have always become the soil that then become the leaves again. How maybe we are not so different from the leaves. How maybe we are always being reborn to something more beautiful than we once were. How maybe that's what waking up each morning is. A reminder that we are born of the same atoms as every plant and bird and mountain and ocean around us. That we don't merely exist in this world. We are of it.
So with that, Konstancja, I'm going to invite you to start your conversation, and I will see you all in a little bit.
Thank you, Katie. The poem was read by the author, Glenn Smith, and I have to say it always makes me feel at home on Earth. I am really pleased to be here, and thank you all for joining. I'm actually an alum of North Brooklyn Parks Alliance. I was there from 2016 to late 2018, so almost 3 years. And it was a really formative time for me working on environmental advocacy and stewardship in Williamsburg and Greenpoint. So I am really happy that you are here supporting the programming of the organization and looking to engage in a conversation about the future of open space. And we are joined tonight by 3 environmentalists, all based in New York City, but not strictly in North Brooklyn. They each represent a different aspect of the conversation on our world, as the title of the panel has it: a farmer, a beekeeper, a gardener. Their roles aren't, of course, so clearly defined, and it is exactly that area, the intersection and the interconnectedness of our natural world, as represented by their professions, that we will explore tonight. So let me introduce Anita, Carolina, and Kofi. So Anita is a native New Yorker dedicated to a life of environmental conservation, urban agriculture, and sustainability. For the past several years, she has worked with the Student Conservation Association, East New York Farms, and currently working at Earth Matter New York on Governor's Island as the Zero Waste Island Coordinator. Carolina Zuniga Aisa is a fashion industry veteran from New York City and an advocate for fair trade as part of the New York City Fair Trade Coalition. She's a certified beekeeper, a Reiki healer, and horticultural therapy practitioner. She, together with friends Stacey Vasquez and Brenda Alvarez, founded Island Bee Project, a nonprofit organization with a mission to spread honeybee and pollinator awareness and to remove barriers to education, experience, and access to urban apiaries. And their team accomplishes their mission through public programming and fun, immersive, impactful experiences. And Kofi Thomas, who's a community builder in Brooklyn, who uses green space as a vehicle for racial and environmental justice. Kofi is the founder of the Good Life Garden, director of the People's Garden, and currently designing a brand new community garden in his neighborhood in Bushwick. So thanks all. And before we go to our first question, I just wanted to say a few words of introduction on the topic and frame it for our audience. For wherever you hail from, and feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat as well and let us know where you're joining from, because this is really a global topic. So yeah, with the realities of climate change setting in for the majority world and for us hyper-locally in New York City, we have really begun to accept as a whole that humanity's demand for resources continues to exceed the regenerative capacity of the planet, and that we need to work in concert to end our reliance on fossil fuels, to protect biodiversity, and to create equal opportunities, like our lives depend on it, because they actually do. The damage done to global ecosystems can still be reversed with the help of radical policies, and technology already exists to mitigate risks and to adapt to a changed climate. And where we find ourselves in a city, cities can be and should be hubs for decarbonization, divestment, adaptive reuse, circular design, inclusion, heritage protection, and resource efficiency. And as we will learn tonight, tradition and innovation come together to address some of these in an exemplary manner on a grassroots level. And few people are aware that several important agro-industries flourished in the city in the past, and the disconnect that followed can actually be partially reversed. And in a great book called Eat the City by Robin Schulman, which I really recommend to everyone, the author takes the reader on a tour of what used to be raised and produced right here in the boroughs: honey, meat, wine, fish, and sugar. And you should really give it a read for some great historical background on that. And we have in the past successfully cultivated a lot right here, but it's not just development that threatens our ability to do so in the future. Loss of biodiversity will be fueled further by loss of pollinators, which the UN estimates at worst at about 40%. And the cascading effect of biodiversity loss may mean unexpected effects on native habitats and food security. And it seems that in a crisis, like, for example, COVID or the world wars, we reach for those basics. We turn to nature. You know, Victory Gardens flourished in our own McCarran Park. They were essentially community gardens that were established to feed the population during a time of scarcity. And where I come from, Poland, we grow food under communism out of necessity when very little was available in stores. And of course, let's not forget that large parts of the world still self-subsist. And we ourselves are looking more and more towards self-reliance. You, our panelists, operate in one of the most densely developed and populated areas in the world, working with nature to reclaim, to rewild, and to restore. You are agents of change. So let's talk about how you do it. My first question to all of you was, what was the moment when you committed or when you realized you have committed to a life of environmentalism? And I would like to start with Carolina.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Konstancja, for that beautiful introduction. I hope everyone can hear me okay. My story, long story short, it's quite unorthodox how I became an environmentalist. But now I even think about further as a child, growing up in Queens, New York, in my parents' backyard. At least I had my introduction to nature there, where I was always spending time in our garden and digging up all the life that exists in our soil, etc. It just seems like ages ago, and it really was, until I grew up in New York City, went to school, and I studied fashion design, and I am a fashion design veteran. And I say veteran because I've been with the industry for 15 years until I realized I really couldn't continue in that industry, only because at that time, I would consider an awakening to what the fashion industry, one of the top polluting industries that exist out there, and my participation in it. There was a great documentary that I watched called True Cost, which is very eye-opening in how the big monster of fashion around the world and how it's been exploiting nature, people, that just did not sit right with me. And that's when I really realized and opened up my eyes into reconnecting with nature. And beekeeping was my path. I just took up beekeeping because it was something that came to a realization in my deep deadlines of corporate fashion, that my mother had called me up and she was just giving me some insight about what's going on. And did you hear about the bees dying? And I knew at that moment that whatever I was doing was not saving any bees. And I was like, you know what? Let me just check this out. And I found a program that Brooklyn Grange was giving in 2015. That's where I met Stacey Vasquez, and we were partnered by the universe to take care of a hive, and we just kept keeping bees. I felt like that was also very therapeutic for me. So there is a lot of healing around beekeeping, and and being aware of like one's mental health at that time with nature is what really sparked my interest. And then a few years later, we met Brenda Alvarez and we started Island Bee Project, just because it just brought us together. And also, there's not a lot of beekeepers like us. We're 3 Latinas and we love beekeeping and everything that it entails, and community building and making it accessible to everyone. And, it became a connected dot moment, and it still is. It's connecting all the dots that here we are now. So that is my long story short.
I love that. I love also the connection to wellness that you make there, and
Absolutely.
that nature has, on lessening some of that eco anxiety. Kofi, let's go to you. Share with us your moment.
Remind me my moment of
when you realized you are committed, you are committing, or you have committed to the life of, environmentalism?
Okay. When did I say I do to the environment? Okay, I got you. Uh, for me was one personally, and then two community wise. One personally, my family is from a little island called Dominica, in the lower Caribbean, and I grew up in the States, so not around a lot of nature. And but as I started to garden in Brooklyn, and just grow different vegetables, I was starting to get calls and messages from like my aunts and my mom and family that were telling me about, like, so my grandma used to grow a lot of food back in Dominica, and we have like a long history of sharing like seeds and saving crops. And so on a personal level, starting to grow food made me closer to my family. On a communal level, uh, kind of cleaning and building up a green space uh, made me, or it just kind of created this pathway for me to get closer to my neighbors. Neighbors started to come in and help out, and we started to have conversations about what we need: healthy food, nutrition, a place for kids to play. But for me, seeing the potential of our green space to unite us as a community, that was, for me, that was when I was like, okay, I'm all in. I'm about the environment.
I love that. Thanks for sharing. And Anita, tell us.
I think it would have been when I kind of stumbled across the youth internship at East New York Farms. Prior to that, I saw my grandmother do several things that are just like very environmentally friendly, right? She grew some tomatoes and potatoes and beans on our balcony, and she would always reuse everything, even things that most people wouldn't reuse. As a child, I found that a little strange, but it did resonate with me. And as I gotten older and came across that youth internship and actually got to go inside a garden and grow my own food, work with compost, that really changed my perspective on things. And it was just like such a great introduction to all these things, because I grew up in the city. I didn't go hiking. My parents didn't have time to take me, upstate or anywhere hiking. So that was like really like eye-opening time for me. And since then, I started exploring more of my own, doing beach cleanups and different conservation projects, and visiting more and more urban spaces, green spaces, and it's so much to learn, even in just New York City.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. And Katie, we have lined up a little cameo appearance by a friend of our organization, Valerie Rizzo. Valerie is a photographer who has spent a lot of the last, especially 2 years, photographing different urban growing spaces. So their farms, their rooftops, their community gardens, mostly public, some private. And she just published the book, and we interviewed her at Kingsland Wildflowers, which is one of our friendly spaces here in Greenpoint. And we'd like to, as a prompt for our next question, play the little clip from our interview.
I've been interested in photographing urban agriculture for years now. Farmers are actually, I think, some of my favorite people because they're very, no pun intended, down to earth. The book is really just an overview of what's being done around the world and the people that are doing it. Why can't that happen in every city? A place like East New York Farms, such a great place for the community, for education. Not to mention that besides them being a farm, they support over 60 community gardens within East New York, and you would never think. And they're just all collectively working together. And I think that that could happen in cities and neighborhoods everywhere. Like, for instance, there's Higher Ground Farm, which is on a rooftop at the Boston Medical Center. Great idea, like a rooftop farm on a hospital rooftop, which also serves as like a food bank. It grows foods for a food bank, for the patients, for the visitors. I mean, what a great idea. Shouldn't every hospital have a rooftop farm? I just think that there's as many projects as there are that are going on. I just think there could be more. I think it's really like opened my eyes to like what can be done, what should be done. There are so many ideas that you can get from the book.
So we'll link to the book. It's a wonderful, heavy coffee table book, wonderful for a gift. Definitely some beautiful photography there. And some of you know Valerie personally. So let's talk about productive landscapes in cities. What Valerie mentions, why isn't this everywhere? And she kind of hints at what I really want to get at. So there is an abundance of these green productive spaces in the city in a book, if you look at a book such as Valerie's, or if you're, like us, plugged into a network of gardens. But it's a little bit like with women CEOs or presidents. You can list them and name them because there are so few of them. So share your perspective on the case study of the spaces that you've been contributing to. Are they outliers or part of a pattern? Anita, let's go to you, please.
So yes, I totally agree. There are many, but still not enough. And I think that a lot of different gardens, they also have very different origin stories, right? So some were just abandoned lots that where a community came together and they decided to just turn it into something beautiful. Sometimes even without the permission of the landowner, which is really badass. Sorry, excuse. So I think that's really amazing. But then other spaces is very planned and deliberate to kind of beautify the community. And I think that kind of combination of all these really makes sense. So I've worked with East New York Farms, where it's been over 2 decades of its establishment, and it's grown so much food and connected so many people in the space. And currently I'm at Earth Matter, where we do have our Soil Start Farm, and we're growing food there as well, but it's more of a teaching tool to kind of showcase the cycle, the closed loop cycle that we can actually achieve if we wanted to. I definitely think that more spaces should be given to projects like these that really will improve the community and everyone's well-being. Unfortunately, a lot of land is just prioritized to building new structures. Creating housing is great, but depends for who, right? So yeah.
Kofi, I'm looking at you. I feel like you can chime in.
Yeah, I think I guess my first ideas as far as like, are we outliers? I don't think so. I think back to Anita's point, like there's a lot of gardens with different origin stories, somewhat close to about 40 gardens in Brooklyn and Queens. And I think what we are missing is kind of like unconditional, I'll say unconditional funding. I think of almost like a beehive. Like if there was like a beehive type structure for communication between gardens where we were sharing our needs, our assets, what we're good at, and had a very clear line of communication, I think that we would see a lot more abundance and health in our community gardens. And we also do need more green spaces, because I know there are, especially in my neighborhood around here, I've been to East New York, there are tons of vacant lots or lots where developers are just warehousing property, waiting for value to go up, in kind of like honor of like the elders who first cleaned up these derelict spaces. I think kind of on our generation is a way to like keep that legacy going, and maybe bring it to like a new level. Like, how do we connect our gardens in Bushwick and our ones in East New York and our ones in Williamsburg, instead of we're all making a kind of overall healthier green environment. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And connectivity is really important for pollinators. So I feel like even though Carolina's is not well, you're based in a couple of spaces, but you don't, it's tell us a little bit more about that, and maybe we can bring it back to the original question of availability and access.
Yes. So Island Beach Project has its beginnings on Governor's Island with Earth Matter. Between 2015 2016 is when we started working with, we met Marissa, the director of Earth Matter, and we just, gave it a shot. We just have a great relationship with Earth Matter in having beehives there. And what was interesting in having hives with Earth Matter and on Governor's Island was the accessibility. That was definitely one aspect of, they're building such a great educational program, which is so needed, but it's so even deep far into Governor's Island, and it's open for education, et cetera. So it was really interesting to experience that this is in a form of a community garden, but, the intention was to have such a big outreach, but still the accessibility was not, it's hard. It's hard to get to an island, and then thinking about all the gardens that of different tiers that were created, whether it's for food or for pollination, there is still that sense of like, is this accessible for everyone? Still, and I hear you, Kofi, on like, if there's a way to connect all of these places, I mean, we're doing it right now on this panel. I think that is like a very crucial step now that we're all working virtually, but it's hard. It definitely is hard, because as much as like when we started off at Governor's Island, we would meet so many people, and there was all this intention to try to go to visit each other's spaces. It's pretty difficult. And I know everyone has the intention of sharing knowledge and meeting your neighbors and meeting other gardeners, but it always does tie back into accessibility, funding. Why is it so difficult to fund these crucial gathering spaces, natural spaces that connect community, that connect you with earth and your own healing and growing food and sharing? I think we're still figuring that out, but I do always trust that it can work and it will happen. We're pretty resilient. New York City is so resilient. We're always being watched, and we're just doing it. And the other place that we, our newest apiary is located on land that's owned by Two Trees, which is actually a site that is for development in the future. But what's really great, and that's how Konstancja reached out to us and other nonprofits, Oko Farms and Compost Power, to use up the space, and I think that is such a great concept, that there are all these empty lots that a lot of developers are just holding on to, but why not share the time and the space to be of use and to experience that in a short amount of time? You can just plant your flowers, you can put place your beehives, but we see a ton of native pollinators. If you put it out there, they will come and they will see you, and it's very rewarding, actually. So yeah, I think that's a concept that can be pushed further as well around New York City.
Yeah,
I put a lot of ideas out there.
Notes taken. And the word I think that each one of you used was support. And what I'm hearing is similar to what I've experienced in years working with conservancies and nonprofits and with the Parks Department and other city agencies, that there are a lot in the way of human resources, where people are typically really, really generous with their time, with their knowledge. And just as you are, being here and sharing with us, But so those connections exist, but other resources may not. So that's something that I want to also get to. But just to pause on the human connection. So it seems that your work really rests on collectivism, and that's something that I think became much more obvious during COVID to all of us. That if you don't have a social network, your chances at survival, I'm just going to call it that, are diminished, and we can hold each other up in situations of crisis. So collectivism that you rely on here is so starkly opposed to the prevalent narrative of individualism and the pursuit of individualism. So can you all speak to some more of to the core values of communal farming and gardening? I think Kofi, if you want to, to tell us a little bit about the different gardens and maybe the differences between how they operate, or, what are some of the values that come to the fore?
I think in thinking about the collective, we often just look to nature for the example. I mean, just to see the way that plants lean on each other and share information. And so we, in our ways, try to do that within our gardens. Director of the People's Garden, founder and director of the Good Life Garden. And it's funny, we're on neighboring blocks, but each block has a slightly different culture. And so part of the collective power, the collective movement is really, I think is really like being humble and listening to what the community is like. So on the People's Garden, we are like a lot of artists, musicians, painters, activists. We're loud, we're Afro-Latino. We party, we plant, and we have been there for years. And we're like, there's a lot of pride in that, and being so connected to our Afro-Latino cultures, we move like a family inside that garden. Like everybody knows everybody's business. Then around the corner, we have the Good Life Garden, and it's a collective, but it's a collective in a different way. But Good Life Garden, we're across the street from a senior home. We have a lot of seniors and families in the block. It's a much quieter street. And the street also is very close to a couple of schools that do not have any outdoor green spaces. So at that garden, the way our collective works is we work as an educational and empowerment garden. So over there, we do more like workshops and classes and yoga and healing and sitting and meditation. But the collective aspect is seen at both, but it just shows up in different ways. So I think the collective is at least for me, the way I see it in the gardens, is it starts off with you finding out kind of like the personality, the identity of people around that community garden, and what they just like what they want to see, what they want to do, and then supporting that. And that's the way it has showed up, has grown in our different gardens. But the commonality is that both gardens are like wide open to everybody. Like anybody can come in. There's no there's not a lot of rules. It's like, this is what we're trying to do. We're very clear about our intention. And then it's like, all right, how can, like, what skills, what knowledge can you bring to help us grow as a community?
Anita or Carolina, feel free to jump in and share.
Sure, I can jump in. I really love when you said party and plants.
Yeah.
That's a great combo. Yeah, I think like all of this work cannot be done by any individual, and we definitely have to collaborate, whether it's like on smaller scale or larger scale. And I'm thinking about things like, oh, if I wanted to grow some crops that I don't have the seeds for, I can buy it, or I can talk to a neighbor and get some seeds. And if I need help with a project or something, doing it on my own would be like impossible and not fun at all. And other people coming in, it's all like a very beautiful learning experience. So like the exchange, whether of like actual goods or knowledge or just like the experiences are very important. And sometimes it's just like if people aren't with you trying to achieve such a goal, like if we don't want to plant more native species or we don't want to grow more food, it's not going to happen in a space. But if we have a lot of people coming together who have same vision, then we'll make it happen, even if they, like, you know, we're lacking in funds, even if we don't already have growing experience, then we're willing to learn. So I think that's really important. And definitely like working in several green spaces, every week there will be new stories from new people that I've met on like how they've come to be where they are, how much they love growing food, how much they love just being in nature. And I think another thing that really kind of spoke to me just all these years is the intergenerational aspect of it. I think it's very easy to kind of disconnect from people who may not be kind of sharing same interests as us, or like kind of around the same age. But gardening, green spaces, nature really brings everyone together. And it's just like, I would never know about certain things if I haven't spoken to an elder about it. So it's a really exciting place to be in, to connect with people no matter the age or culture.
Carolina, I am saving a spot for you here just because I just want you to talk a little bit maybe more, and that's you know, it's adjacent to what we've been discussing, and it's just the way that bees are, right? We know that native pollinators typically don't live, you know, in groups. Like you can't keep bumblebees as much as I would like to. Shout out to bumblebees, my favorite pollinator by far. You can't buy a colony and you can't keep it. However, you know, honeybees lend themselves to that, so they can be assisted by humans and they give back in return, and they are in that kind of, you know, really communal. So can you talk a little bit about, give us like a little primer on bees, on honeybees?
Yeah, definitely. All right. Who has 5 hours?
How they support each other. I guess that's the, if we have to narrow it down.
Absolutely. So, you know, honeybees, you think of a hive, you think of the hive mind, the community that they protect the queen and they sustain themselves. And pretty much what I've gathered from working with bees is just like how intrinsic they are about communicating and how they communicate with pheromones. Just kind of using that idea and just watching them, how they communicate and how they work as one for the common goal, which is to, for them, collect a lot of nectar for food supply, to grow together for the winter, for survival. And, you know, when we take a step back at the macro level of like what we're doing, us as beekeepers in trying to grow our community, we've only been meeting the most amazing beekeepers far wide and beyond, from different places like in Puerto Rico, and different beekeepers with different missions, and like how they use beekeeping also to connect everyone, how community gardens are also connecting cultures, and all this like information carried intergenerationally as well and interculturally. So that's what I can plug bees in there as, you know, like if we can see them and their health and how they're doing, it's almost a mirror of like how we are doing and our own health as well. And the other thing that's interesting about bees is that not a lot of people know this, that they're not typically native to North American continent. They came from different places, different continents, like in Asia, Africa, and Europe. And they were brought over in the 1600s. So in the time span of how we've been working with honeybees, you know, now it's really connected to our food production, you know, and I know there's a lot of conversation about like honeybees and native pollinators, but also we need to talk about like our absolute dependence at this point for food there as well. So it's a lot of conversations that we can break off from there. And when you talk about community gardens and seeing all the native pollinators that are helping you raise and pollinate all your fruits and vegetables, and how we are also adapting together with honeybees in urban and outside of urban areas. It's all really very much connected, and it's a delicate balance as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing to the fore what oftentimes gets lost. It's the invisible work of pollinators. As animals, they are, they tend to be invisible. Insects are notoriously difficult to study. We all know about the study on wolves. We in the city here locally are really excited about oyster restoration. Those are animals that you can hold, you can observe, you can see. That is not always the case with insects. It requires a lot of patience and planting the right things, because they really do have that sense where they don't go where there is nothing there. Although in the city they do suffer from exhaustion because they do have to travel far for food, and that's their main cause of extinction in cities, because cities tend to be, and this is an interesting sort of tidbit, typically really biodiverse. And I would love to also incorporate some, you can maybe mention some of the things that you're growing, Kofi and Anita especially, because they tend to, you tend not to monocrop in a community garden. Like I'm yet to see a garden that only grows cucumbers or tomatoes or potatoes, which is the case if you go a little bit even, out to Long Island, but not to mention these, the really giant fields of big ag out in the Midwest, where you really have one crop that covers, vast species at flowers or blooms at a certain time, providing food for pollinators. And then once that goes away, once their blooming time is gone, they are left with essentially nothing. So we have this continuous source of food by and large in community gardens and urban farms. So can you name like 2 or 3 species that you grow that do really well, native? Actually, I'll leave it up to you. Tell us what you grow that's a little bit more maybe, I don't know, maybe culturally appropriate for the areas where you work, or lesser known.
At Soil Star Farm, we actually have this project called the Heritage Beds, where a lot of different gardeners/farmers from different cultures actually come and tend to a bed. So we have like a Caribbean bed, Japanese bed, German, to name a few. And it's really cool. One crop I guess I'd like to randomly bring up is sesame. I've never seen a sesame plant before, and I finally got to see it. And I think if no one told me, I would never have thought. But I think there's an interesting balance, because on one hand, we want to really bring a lot of like cultural foods to where people from those cultures are now staying. But also it brings up the question of whether or not that species would thrive here or should. I think as long as we don't do monocrop, and we kind of be very mindful of the impact of each crop, then I think we can definitely have more crops and use it as a teaching tool as well. Another thing I wanted to mention is corn. 3 sisters, I guess we can talk about that. So having squash, corn, and beans together. At Soul Star Farm, if you ever visit there, we have one row of corn that's probably like 10 feet tall, maybe a little higher, I don't know, but it's really a sight to see. And we grow a lot of herbs on the farm, and when you let a lot of plants flower, then all the pollinators get to enjoy it if we don't consume it ourselves.
Yeah, and Kofi, I've been to your garden. I've seen the incredible richness of it. Walk us through the garden a little bit.
Yeah, so the garden is designed in a way where part of it is for, let's say, like the popular crops, the ones we always get requests for from the neighborhood. And then a few bed spaces are for imagination, experimentation. Let's see if it can grow. And then summer space is for seniors. And what I've been really lucky to witness is how different people on our block have preserved just what's been passed down to generations. Two crops that are culturally significant on my block. Jalapenos are major. They are major. I have some neighbors, some homies from all over Mexico, and like, it's funny, there are certain crops where you can see people's faces change when they see them. Jalapeno is one of them. For most people. I saw another one that's important, culturally significant, watermelon. Watermelon is something that like I have witnessed like older Black folks like stop, like just look at the size of them, and then after some conversation, it's like, oh, like finding out like they have deep roots in like the Carolinas or Georgia, and like you just like you're like these aren't just foods; these are like people's lives. Like they see that, and then they remember growing up with their grandmother work in the field. And then a last cultural crop that I'll mention because it's so phenomenal is called Karaili or Cersei or bitter melon. It's a crop that I grew along the fence at the behest of my neighbors from Trinidad because they said it's good for your blood, and so trying to be, give the community free medicine. Like, yeah, let's grow it, and we started growing it. And as we were growing the Karaili, people from Guyana visited, and they had a different name for it. And then one of my like favorite elders from the senior home, who's from China, he knew what it was. And then that started getting my like head spinning, like, well, how do all of these people from different parts of the world all value and cherish this one vegetable? And so that got everybody talking, and then we did more research, and it's one of those magical plants that's good for your blood. It's an alternative to insulin, so it can make you more independent from having to go to the pharmacy, save you a ton of money. It's just one of those plants. But to see so many different people from around the world talk about it and grow it in the same space, that meant a lot. And that was I guess my favorite like culturally significant plant.
Makes me happy just to hear you talk about it. And definitely the garden is worth a visit. And one of the most amazing things about the Good Life Garden is that the door tends to be open a lot, as opposed to a lot of the community gardens that we have here, unfortunately, in North Brooklyn. They do have their specific hours, and we all know, of course, they're staffed by volunteers, and then it's great when they're open. But this one is a real respite for the seniors and for the neighborhood, and it's it's a very open space. I feel like we're in a really good place talking about what these spaces can accomplish, but I want to go back to what Kofi said at some point about unconditional support from the city for these ventures. So I have a very relevant clip from our friend Rafael Espinal, who's the former council member for District 37, and he here in Brooklyn. And we know that the challenges to, in an urban environment are plenty for gardeners, and gardening on borrowed land or on leased land that doesn't maybe necessarily have like a fixed status, from costs to small margins of what you grow, and lack of clarity in zoning as to where food growing is even allowed. And there's also straight up restrictions preventing I think proliferation of green spaces. So there's a lot of barriers. So we will hear now from Rafael, who will explain to us how his idea for the Office of Urban Agriculture, which he proposed in 2017 and 2018, before he left his job as a council member. And he'll kind of talk about the background of it and perhaps future outlook. So
I think there's a lack of will from the current administration, or a lack of interest on the topic. When you're a city of 9 million people, and the top issues are affordable housing and homelessness, and closing the wealth gap. Issues like creating an Office of Urban Agriculture and urban ag in general are just not as, in their eyes, as much of a pressing matter. Which is why it's important for local leaders, for elected officials, to be able to play that role of being the megaphone on why this is an important aspect in our city's ecosystem. That I would say was the main challenge we faced. There was the will in the city council, but the administration didn't feel like it was necessary. There was a food czar they felt that was already in place, that was thinking about food access within our city. There's the Parks Department, which they say oversees a lot of the community gardens in our city. There's the Buildings Department. There's all these departments in which they can point to and tell you that they're playing a role in supporting community gardens and supporting food production. But our argument was that it's not centralized, so which in itself creates barriers for any individual who is trying to create a space and we're producing food or thinking about how we're going to produce food locally in our city. So I would say it was just bureaucracy that got in the way, red tape, lack of information, lack of will. But I think moving forward, there is going to be a space in which this conversation will now start to become a priority, given that climate change is one of the biggest topics, or one of the biggest challenges we're facing now. Given that our city is going to continue to grow, the trend continues, numbers continue to show our city is growing, we have to start thinking about how we're going to start feeding people and closing a lot of these health disparities and food disparities. Quite frankly, my main partner on this issue was current Borough President Eric Adams. He will be our next mayor. And if the history of his advocacy on this issue lives true to and carries on to his current next role, I can see this being a priority for our city in the next 4 years.
And I will mention that District 37 covers Bushwick, East New York, Cypress Hills, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and Brownsville in Brooklyn. So these are neighborhoods that have some of the lowest, availability of fresh produce. And obviously, Anita, you can, it's, home for you, so you can tell us more about it. But what is the role the city can play in facilitating a transition to a more wildlife and human-friendly environment?
Yeah, I think definitely having more support on that end would be very helpful to kind of have a more kind of structured approach. And I think like we mentioned before, kind of community, like our elected officials are very well part of our community. If they're not paying attention, if they don't really care, if they don't push funds towards these projects, then we're lacking support. Much needed support. And I think that with more support from that end, then we can have kind of more exposure to, because like outreach, if we're only depending on like grassroots organizations, not like nonprofits and individuals, it will only go so far. I think it'll be like a very tight knit group, but if we have it from any government agencies, it will be more powerful, and we can kind of use other tools as well. Like, hey, if you don't compost, for example, and you're sending organic waste to landfill, that's an issue. Fines, but also not just implementing fines. Of course, can create a system where everyone has the opportunity to participate. So make sure that it's equitable and not just penalizing people who may not have the education or the resources to do so.
Mm-hmm. And Kofi, what do you think? You mentioned the need for support. Would an Office of Urban Agriculture, does that sound like a good idea to you?
An Office of Urban Agriculture. That's the timing of this is very good. So my old neighbor, Mr. Clifford, do I have that picture open? Wow. I don't know if you can see. No, it might not show up. But he's 88. All right. So he just gave me a book that is titled Canning, Freezing, Storing Garden Produce. And it's put out by the U.S. Department of Ag in 1977. All right, so it is important. It would be helpful. Everything would be helpful. Like more organization would be helpful. I think of it like there's a lot of passion and energy and know-how on the grassroots level. We are invested in our communities because we live here. So we're going to work harder than anybody to make our green spaces beautiful, to share food, to learn. What would make it more possible? What would kind of help take us to new heights would be that type of support from an urban agricultural level, where like share the knowledge, whether it be however through books or tutorials or workshops, Zoom panels on how different farmers grow their crops. Like I know a ton of garden nerds out there who would be excited to have somewhat of a library of information on that. And then also it would give the communications infrastructure for us to be able to talk to more gardens locally and also statewide. So like if you like to have access to like their email blasts and to how they put up like the way they put up flyers when like around like the MTA when like a train is closing. Like what if we had like that type of resource to say like, oh, like there's a garden opening and have like flyers all up and down a block. So those type of resources and and staffing combined with like the passion, the connection to community, and just like the energy and know-how that the people that live in these neighborhoods have. I think those like that structure plus that passion would make for a lot of impact. So yes, short answer, yes to urban ag.
Structure and passion, yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I do want to pull at something, at a thread there in what Raphael said, that the city sent them away sort of saying, there's the Department of Buildings, there's the Parks Department, there is the, food, then that was now there is a Office of sustainability, Mayor's Office of Sustainability. So sure, there are places where, but creating, and what you or also said earlier, right? A beehive, you call it a beehive for community gardens. That's starting to sound like an idea that we should revive. And, we, as Raphael mentioned, we have a champion potentially in our future mayor. And definitely that's something that I want us to walk away with, that there was a plan, and you can look it up. I will, in a moment, link to an article about that, where you can see it even links you to the city page where the legislation can be where the proposed bill can be accessed, so you can see sort of the scope of it. Something that we could continue pushing for, because like he said, he actually had 46 co-sponsors in the council, so that's nearly all of them, right? So why not? And if I'm hearing this from most of you, or if not all of you, that there is a need for that, then that could be our action item. I do have another question, which is sort of one of my favorites. So, because we will soon move to a question, a Q&A portion of our meeting, but something that, and you shared a little bit about, these surprising plants, but is there any concept in your practice that you think is widely misunderstood? And I'll share one from mine, where I always like to set the record straight. Weeds don't exist. A weed is not a botanical category. It is just a plant that grows where you want it, where you don't want it, at a time you don't want it to be there. So there's just a lot of judgment when we approach plants that are growing happily, by and large. Those are things that typically thrive, like wild growth. It could be Queen Anne's lace, or it could be mugwort. Those are things that can be used medicinally, and for example, and decoratively. There are a lot of uses, yes, that we don't know about, or people don't know about, and they tend to use the umbrella term weed. So I like to stop them from doing that if I can. So if you can share one concept from your practice where you would want to set the record straight. And I'm going to go to Carolina.
Yeah, there's a couple. There's a few. One of them that from my experience and my friend's experience in having an bee project is that we are not your typical beekeepers. It's not very often you run into female women of color being beekeepers. And there have been many conversations on like how we have met people who have found us, whether on social media or met us in person, that it's inspiring, that it's not something that is impossible to be really good at, or using it in such a positive way. And that, there's also commercial beekeeping that has a lot of its own bad rap because it goes hand in hand with agriculture today as well. That there's ways that you can keep bees in urban areas in a very holistic manner, sustainable manner, educational, medicinal, and story sharing, community building, etc. There's a lot that can go hand in hand in this practice of beekeeping or bee tending. And also just our connection with honeybees in general throughout human history, ever since the Egyptians have one of their hieroglyphic symbols as a bee, which means a lot of abundance and gold and the sun. And there's a lot of connection there. There is conversations and articles out there about competition within pollinators. But it's also something to think about in many aspects of, how we go about taking over certain ecosystems ourselves as humans, and there's something there to think about and to learn from. And I think there are definitely ways to work with honeybees and other pollinators and finding that balance. Let nature speak to you and listen to her as well. If there is something that's not working, perhaps let nature do its thing and find ways to find harmony.
Bee tending, that's such a beautiful phrase that I think I'm going to start using now instead of beekeeping. Anita, can you share with us?
So concept I think often needs to be kind of talked about a little more would be waste. So similar to what you were saying about how like unwanted plants, everyone calls it weeds, and so I know that some spaces they actually end up going into a black trash bag and into landfill because seeds like the seeds would survive through composting, and it will kind of be more of an issue later on where it overtakes other plants. But I think that that along unwanted plants can be moved and transplanted elsewhere. Like it shouldn't be disposed of most of the time, unless it's a really terrible invasive. And also in terms of food, there are many plants. You can eat most of it, and in our culture, a lot of it is like unwanted. You see like on like chef shows where like they just cut and dispose of it, and it's very wasteful. And also when we talk about waste, we always think of just like kind of the end, like what to do with something. But it very much involves the beginnings of the item as well. So reduction, reuse, and then how can we take care of it at the end of its life, to ensure that we're dealing with it responsibly. So composting is a really big one. I think if we kind of direct our attention to more natural materials, then we would really eliminate a lot of waste in our lives and eliminate the amount of waste that goes into the environment and contaminate and pollute.
Yeah, it's not an end, it's a beginning. I love that too. Kofi, do you have any thoughts on a practice that you think is misunderstood in your field?
One in particular, whenever I'm pruning trees, I get a lot of I'll say hesitation, sometimes arguments from people walking by. I think there's a lack of knowledge on how to how to be how to be helpful to nature, to kind of the role we play in this world. I like that quote from the poem earlier, but how we are of the earth. Yeah, I think we're so young in terms of trees that we haven't seen like tree cycles, and there's such a lack of knowledge on how indigenous peoples used to like create controlled fires and do different practices to like be part of and manage the land. And since we don't have that knowledge, I think some of us get very, I'd say, scared when we see like a tree being pruned and don't know, I don't know, just that what it does for the rest of the environment. So I think that would be one concept. Another concept though, which is not planned but more of like a social thing, is the way that we talk about sustainability and environmentalists and what they look like and what their practices are. Because I think that sometimes we get like a very narrow view of like what an environmentalist is or does. But like Anita talked about her grandmother saving things, and my grandma used to save some things. My mom doesn't throw any jars away. So a lot of us have environmentalists in our families, but they aren't touted as sustainable. But and with the fashion, like my grandma used to sew, so like they are these environmentalists. So I think that they should get credit for being earth keepers. So that's that.
I just wanted to give it a moment so it can resound. They should get credit for being earth keepers. That's beautiful. Katie, do we have any questions? Do you want to ask any questions? I certainly could keep talking, asking and listening, but let's open it up.
And in the meantime, I can ask a question. And Kofi, I think that was an interesting comment about the trees, because that was definitely me a long time ago when I would see tree pruners and I would say, why are you doing this to our trees? You need to let them grow. So I think I appreciate and agree with you that there are some misunderstandings about the work, or some, I think even now, despite all of the media attention on the need and importance for bees, people think that bees are bad, some people. So I think having this conversation to bring it all together and explain the functionality, importance, and role of these different features is great. So thank you all. And I guess my question would be, specific to, my role at the North Brooklyn Parks Alliance, is we specifically work in urban parks, urban public parks. And so how would these projects, or do these projects potentially have a different impact, different process, depending on what kind of space that you're in? So whether you're in, a public park with the Parks Department or a community garden, do you feel like jurisdiction matters in your particular projects? And one reason I bring this up is because we talked a lot about, and Konstancja brought up the concept of an office for urban agriculture. One thing that we're looking at as well is an office or at least a position on the public realm. So looking at all these different spaces, whether it's you know, a green corridor, an open street, a public park, a public plaza, you know, these are all of our people's open spaces. We all use them. And so I'm curious, in your individual projects, does the type of space matter? And I open it up to anyone who's willing to share their thoughts.
Yeah, I think it definitely does have kind of impact on like what resources are needed, what audience it draws, if it's gonna be something that like will be supported like decades to come. And I think on one hand, kind of having someone or a group overseeing them, making sure all these spaces are maintained is very important, but it also may create may create a barrier of like entry. So in some gardens, mentioned before, where there are open hours, and I think it's necessary depending on where you are, because if it's open 24/7, it may be harder to maintain, keep it a beautiful space for everyone to enjoy. But on the other hand, with certain open hours, certain demographics may not be able to enjoy the space if someone works like a full 10-hour day, and by the time they come home from work, they can't enjoy it. So a lot of these things, it's very complicated, and I think it should really be put out there and discussed, and not have like really rigid rules for each of these spaces, because ultimately, like, is it for the community or is it for a specific group of people? So like, have to keep those in mind.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely matters as far as like who the audience is. There's you know, who kind of owns the space will alter accessibility, inclusivity, and even intentions. Like, you know, for example, if a space is a triangle or a public green space, then there's like unspoken certain parameters of like the type of programming that you do. So yeah, it's cool to do programming that's around the environment, but you would probably need permission to do anything that was kind of diving deep into racial justice or housing rights, land equity. Whereas let's say privately owned, maybe like in a land trust, but a community-owned garden, you'd be able to have those kinds of conversations and that type of connection. But at the same time, sometimes you just want like a big, beautiful park to walk around and sit quietly and read a book. So I do think that we actually need like both of those types of spaces in the communities. But I'm a big proponent of like, we need abundance. I think what happens is we get Brooklyn's already stressful, all right? But it gets more stressful when there's not a lot of options. So when there's like just one garden, then there's like, it feels like there's a lot more pressure to like get into that garden. And then you get like upset if like that garden's not open. Because again, like you're already stressed out from whatever job you work and there not being a lot of green space. But with an abundance of green spaces, it kind of like alleviates the pressure off of each other green space. And like I would love if there was like more prospect parks and more small gardens that have like live music. Like I want there to be all of that, because they're going to serve different needs of the community. Like they serve the community in different ways. Like a giant park with a beautiful pond and swans serves the community in a different way than a small park where like all the neighbors know each other and have a birthday party. But they're both needed as I think as part of like a healthy community.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Anita and Kofi were saying is that I guess it does and it doesn't, because depending on where the space is available, it becomes an expression of the community. So it's like, it definitely matters to have more green space, especially at a time when we are experiencing a climate emergency with these very high heat indexes that we're experiencing. And in neighborhoods that don't have enough green space, there are maps that shows the different temperatures of these certain areas that have lack of green space. It's a refuge, not only just for building community and for growing food, it's just a refuge. And I'm all about an office for urban agriculture. I think that's amazing. And it will at least give everyone access to have their voices heard, because that's what they're supposed to represent, is to collect all of these voices and create new policies from there. But I'm all about a green space, absolutely. And large or small, it always makes a big difference. I mean, I've met people, and I know people who have very lush, abundant fire escape gardens that changes their lives, right? So I think also having taken courses in horticultural therapy, it's something that should exist even within hospitals, even within elderly homes. You know, that could be like a whole other session in itself to talk about just the benefits of looking at a flower or a tree. You know, it's, these things are very subtle, but they do change your state of well-being.
I think is coming through for me here, hearing everyone, is that, and this is true in nature too, that there really is no recipe for a balanced ecosystem, to a degree that ecosystem balances itself. Of course, unfortunately, human activity is a massive disruptor, but if we zoom in, we started with this really big perspective on climate change, but it was all about zooming in here on these individuals and what they do in their spaces. I think that we see that that balance kind of, it creates itself. Like that balance is there when people participate, and some spaces will emphasize food production, some spaces will emphasize youth training, some places will emphasize culture. They're really flexible. Parks are generally some of the most democratic spaces we have in the city, where folks, there's some barriers, of course, in terms of just location and access, but typically once a park is there, it's a space where people can express themselves, meet, and be kind of unbothered, which in New York City is you can also be bothered in the park. That definitely happens, but in the sort of idyllic version of it. So they are places, of climate change resiliency, economy drivers, and that balance sort of sorts itself out based on its context. That's what comes to me from what I've heard.
We have just 2 minutes left. So any final thoughts from the panelists before, or the moderator, before we say goodnight for the evening?
Sure. I'm not too sure where like all of our audiences are coming from, but I think like everyone should take some time, go out and explore and check out different projects. Like I started out with gardening, but I like dove into composting and waste management, sustainability. Go out rock climbing, or like go whitewater rafting, and really submerge yourself in nature in many ways, and just like feel free to explore, and you'll find yourself wanting to contribute in many ways, and you have the power and the knowledge to contribute more than you may know.
Well, thank you. So thank you, Kofi and Anita and Carolina, and especially Konstancja, for leading tonight's conversation. Really about the potential of how we can use our public spaces, and how they can play a role in having a global impact. And so, we're all working together to better our world. And I appreciate you taking your time on this Thursday night to talk about it. And so here at the North Brooklyn Parks Alliance, our next panel as part of this series, our final panel, is going to focus on the surge in stewardship that has taken place during the pandemic as volunteers kind of step forward and try to fill that gap in some city and public services amid a global and social health and fiscal crisis. And so we have a couple of events coming up I wanted to plug as well. And under the Cambridge Park on September 19th, we have our final reggae show. September 26th, we have a Festival of Soul. I encourage you to go to NBK Parks Instagram or website to learn about that. And of course, I can't let you all go without telling you to save the date for our gala on October 7th, which will kick off a 3-day light festival at Under the Cambridge Park. So kind of felt like this fall we all are going to need some light in our lives, especially as the days get shorter. So thank you again for joining us tonight. It's beautiful. I hope you all get out and enjoy some nature on this Thursday night. And Konstancja, I can't thank you enough. I really appreciate it. And we will see you all soon, either on Zoom or in real life.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank
Good
you.
night.